Hello, welcome to the second episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York, and my podcast is about culture wars, the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats and lying instead of the real things and the big debates. I'll be talking to the players and commentators in those culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening. And we'll have some fun and some gossip, and we'll ask really vital questions like, who makes the best suede loafers in Jermyn Street? My guest today is the scourge of angry phoners in on LBC radio in London. Now, James O'Brien has been a talk radio host for 22 years at the 52-year-old LBC, which was originally a commercial London station that went national in 2014. And he's Britain's best-known dedicated talk radio host. But he's a very unusual example of the breed. He's unusual both because he's cut through to the national conversation, which sounds rather grand, for what he says in his Thought for Today pieces to microphone before he talks to callers. And for the way he handles those callers. He's controversial, he's memorable, and he gets big numbers. And a New Statesman profile back in the days by somebody called Dorian Linsky described talk radio of having been dominated by right-wing blowhards. And he certainly isn't that. Some of his callers get, rather understandably, cross with him and call him all sorts of things across the spectrum from woke to much ruder words. And that New Statesman piece called him the conscience of liberal Britain. And that's because he's big on YouTube and on social media generally, and his pieces and his conversations with callers go viral. E.g., which EU law shall we get rid of now Brexit is done? Now, those conversations are singular because he's forensic. He asks those questions that every vox popper should, but very few do. He asks people what they really mean by what they say, what evidence they've got for their confident views, and where they got it. Often these stout party callers collapse, and they end up like angry goldfish glugging away but nothing coming out. Then they call him names, and then they hang up. Better version of this is when wonderful revelations come out, because he's got them to say what they really mean. So, back in the day, eager Brexit supporters talked about big things like sovereignty and freedom from unelected bureaucrats. But they couldn't say, when pressed, anything the EU had done that restricted them personally. And then some went on to acknowledge that the real problem was that the EU had let in foreigners of various kinds. But James O'Brien wasn't always the conscience of liberal Britain. He's been on a journey, dread word, from his early career as a public school and LSE graduate looking for newspaper work. His dad was a journalist, and doing unlikely sounding things like slaving on the Daily Express gossip column back in the 90s. I can relate to that sort of thing. This journey is described in his best-selling books from How to Be Right to How Not to Be Wrong, and his latest is How They Broke Britain, which was published last year, in which he names the guilty men and women, mostly men, mostly right-wingers, but including Liz Truss and Jeremy Corbyn. The earlier books explain how he got there, that journey again, including his psychotherapy and his changing attitude to things like public school beatings, which he defended when younger. What marks everything he does is a sort of moral indignation. How can this be set against a lot of self-questioning? Have I got this completely wrong or what? And a determination to search out systematic disinformation from politicians and opaquely funded think tanks and the media that support them and run with their stories. He's forensically, that word again, detailed about the names and the connections and the nature of the lies. Now, some people admire these analyses very much. Others think he's a smug member of the Metropolitan Liberal Elite, whoever they are, doing virtue signalling, whatever that might be. Good afternoon, Mr. James O'Brien.
Peter, that was delightful, thank you.
What is the Metropolitan Liberal Elite? Who is it, and are you in it?
I'm definitely in it, but I'm not quite sure what it is. I'm in it according to people who bandy the phrase around a lot. It can be a bit lonely. I think at one point it was just me, Gary Lineker and Carol Vorderman.
Well, that's unstoppable.
So no, it's a holy trinity.
Yes.
Of course, I'm the only one with a media platform where I can discuss politics now. But so I don't know that it's particularly big. I think it is just shorthand for people who. I mean, it's hard to answer without sounding smug, which kind of proves the point of people who use the phrase, doesn't it? But I think it originally means people who don't believe that immigration is the root of all our country's problems, and latterly it became people who understood what Brexit was going to be like in reality as opposed to in fantastical theory.
And people, one might suggest, who think that their wives and sisters are going to be raped in Claridge's Ladies' Loos by trans people.
Yeah, they would use the phrase a lot, wouldn't
Yes.
they? And to point out that that's probably not true would therefore make you part of this problematic cabal of people. Listen, I would say roughly people who try and use evidence and reason as a foundation stone for their opinions, as opposed to emotion and perhaps misinformation.
But the implication is, isn't it, that they're metropolitan for a kick-off.
Yeah.
So they're in London like what you are, like what I am, and they're lucky, and they might have been privately educated and.
But that applies to all the people who've popularised the phrase, doesn't it? So, it's a bit like the absurdity of a Boris Johnson or a Nigel Farage claiming that they are anti-establishment or that they're somehow held back by the society that we inhabit. They all live in London or have lived in London. They're all privately educated. It's a meaningless phrase, but of course, as you alluded to in the introduction, it's one that works until you properly interrogate it. And as soon as you properly interrogate it, it largely falls apart. So, metropolitan, what's wrong with being urban? What's wrong with living in a city? Liberal. Since when did being liberal become a problem? It's history's taught us that it's the least bad, generally speaking, of all the other options if you value humanity. And then elite. I don't know what that means. If it refers exclusively to private education, then they've got a point. But it doesn't. Gary Lineker was the son of a Leicester market trader, and he's one of the high priests. Carol Vorderman grew up in Wales, and she's the high priestess of the Metropolitan Liberal Elite. So it just means people who make us feel stupid, I think, or people who make us feel bigoted, and therefore we need to find a label to stick on them that somehow undermines and diminishes their role in discourse.
Could anybody make out a case for there being such a thing as a metropolitan illiberal elite? Are there such people?
Well, yes. Well, I think there's loads of them. I mean, the danger here is that you end up turning into the thing that you're critiquing. But one of the things I tried to do in the last book was show the connections between the opaquely funded think tanks, the media, newspapers and magazines that really dominate all print discourse in this country. And they all have quite a lot in common. And they are increasingly illiberal. They are most definitely elite. And they are, I suppose remote working notwithstanding, they are almost all exclusively metropolitan as well. So I don't know, if you say the Metropolitan Liberal Elite doesn't really exist, because who's on the list? I mean, literally, who's on the list? But the Metropolitan Illiberal Elite, you'd have pretty much every columnist on every national newspaper bar The Guardian and The Mirror. You'd have all of the Tufton Street located the sort of gravitating around Tufton Street lobby groups that call themselves think tanks or charities, but are really just in the business of trying to influence media coverage, which is obviously quite easy to do when most of the gatekeepers of the media share a very similar ideological outlook. You'd have everyone who's ever been anywhere near the Spectator magazine, the Telegraph. I mean, the list of whatever the opposite of the Metropolitan Liberal Elite is, we could be here all day picking them all off one by one, and I do quite a lot of it in the book. But the Metropolitan Liberal Elite, I genuinely, in terms of people who've got a regular media platform from which they can espouse their political opinions, I think you'd struggle to get into double figures. You might even struggle to use up all the fingers on one hand.
You've got me there. I'll be thinking about it. So would it include that hefty proletarian Rod Liddle, for instance? Where would we put Rod Liddle in this great spectrum?
I'm not overly familiar with his work, but some of it sort of pops up over the parapet, doesn't it? And he says things about not being able to be a teacher because he wouldn't be able to stop himself from committing statutory rape on some of the children in his charge. I think you've got a kind of Muslims are awful, immigration is terrible. They're just, it's a graph, isn't it? And they're all on it. It just, some of them are more performatively obnoxious than others. And as far as I know, he's quite performatively obnoxious. It's very good for business, isn't it? I mean, you know, to go from being a BBC producer, which is when I first heard of him, to be someone in the business of getting paid lots of money for attacking the BBC all the time, seems to make commercial sense, if not moral or necessarily intellectual.
The BBC is a great subject, which, as you know, I'm very interested in, and we'll come back to that.
I enjoyed the book you wrote with Patrick very much. I thought that was a very important intervention.
Well, we were worried about the BBC and its future, and I think we were probably right to be.
Yeah.
Now, your latest book, if there was a screen, I should be doing this.
Yes, fantastic.
Your latest book is about how they broke Britain. Is it still that bad, or are there reasons to be cheerful? And now we've got the Labour Party in charge, and the Americans have got Donald Trump, and they seem to be getting on terribly well. Starmer and Trump had a lovely phone call, and Rachel Reeves is admitting the president's great positive energies, which he'd seen demonstrated at Davos. It's all great, isn't it? Great?
Well, here's the thing, because that report in The Times, which of course is edited by Tony Gallagher, who has previously edited both The Sun and The Telegraph and been a protégé of Paul Dacre at the Daily Mail, that report in The Times was a terrible stitch-up job on Rachel Reeves, because essentially all she said was energy is good. But by the time it had been put through the mangle of presumably editorially overseen sub-editing, it became some sort of endorsement of Donald Trump, which she categorically didn't make. But, you know, that's how it works. The nonsense is halfway around the world before the truth has got its trousers on. It's a great achievement. So she's got that hung around her neck now.
Yeah.
The obvious answer to your question is that we don't know, because, of course, it's an improvement to have well-meaning managerialists in Downing Street, people who don't claim that freedom is slavery or that up is down or that black is white. That has to be an improvement on the Brexit-inspired absolute fantasy politics that we've been living with since 2016. But it might just be a hiatus. It might be a brief reprieve, you know. I find it extraordinary that we are contemplating support for the politicians that sold Brexit. So in the case of Reform Limited, it's literally the key salesman of Brexit, bearing no responsibility whatsoever for the biggest sale of his salesman career, and now hoovering up support for being handed even more power or being trusted with even more of the national interest. So, you know, Starmer is a crucial figure, and not one that inspires chest-thumping loyalty in many people. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. He's certainly no populist or demagogue, but it's too early to say. A lot is going to depend on the economy, isn't it? If people feel a bit better off, then we'll probably be okay. If people feel a bit worse off or a lot worse off, then all the old tropes come back into play. The othering of immigrants will be weaponised even further, and the political capital that you gain by doing that could end up in the hands of people who are every bit as awful as what's gone before, and quite possibly even worse. So no, I'm not relaxing. There was an interesting piece in the Times today by Libby Purvis about all the Singaporean buy-to-let landlords who would not be pouring money into off-plan investments on new builds in this country if we weren't actually stable and secure. And I derive little glimmers of hope and optimism from things like that.
She's a very sensible woman.
She is usually, so I took that on board. But then you remember the riots in the summer that many people still refer to as the Farage riots, where, you know, we had pogroms on our streets, Peter. We had actual pogroms.
The Tommy Robinson riots.
Or the Tommy Robinson riots, whatever you prefer. And those people enjoy support of a kind that is always susceptible to flame fanning, you know, and that's when I think things are even more broken than I realised when I finished the book.
Someone I know who used to work for Tommy Robinson, you know, there's now so strange as folk, but then stopped doing it, said that Tommy Robinson was supported with lots of money from very right-wing Americans from the word go. And that is why wags amongst my friends noted that he was wearing the Gucci belt buckle the moment he appeared into our popular consciousness. It's a thought. These things are not unimportant.
No, and they're rarely organic either, particularly in the modern ecosystem. And we've seen latterly with Elon Musk that the people who wield enormous power and influence always need some foot soldiers on the ground. Well, they need puppets, don't they?
And Steve Bannon, always very keen on Tommy Robinson, said he was great Englishman, and Elon Musk has taken it up. It's very strange. Now, you make it sound all a bit grim, or potentially grim.
Yes.
What's the worst thing, the worst prospect for us as a little G7 medium-sized nation, one that's got an unfashionably centrist or liberal, the Trump word? I wonder if Starmer knows what liberal means in America. What's the worst thing that could be up the road for us?
In abstract terms, it's if we get caught between two stools. So we've elected not to be in the European Union, which is obviously historically our biggest trading partner. If we, and then you can answer it two ways, can't you? So the worst thing would be that we end up in Trump's pocket, but that might be economically beneficial in the unlikely but not impossible event that he continues the trajectory of improvement and enrichment that Joe Biden has set the country on. But is that a good thing? Because that would then involve turning a blind eye or even helping to normalise the obscenities of what his administrations have and continue to represent. So becoming a sort of satellite Trumpian state, whoever's prime minister, seems pretty hideous, unless it's all about the economy, stupid, and that delivers an economic advantage, which poses all sorts of moral dilemmas about who you should be getting into bed with. And then on an entirely domestic level, it's not beyond, I think for the first time in my life, I can conceive of a far-right government in this country, regardless of who leads it, whether it's Farage or one of these new breeds of Tories that seem to be dedicated to copying his every twist and turn. I'd never really thought that before, but I think that's more than feasible now. And that
yes,
obviously is a pretty unappetizing prospect.
Part of that, one of the thing that some people always say about the alleged Metropolitan Liberal Elite, the Western world clearly turning right now, the parts that can do any turning, and the recently right-wing, because he didn't used to be, author David Goodhart and his friend, the recently former professor Matthew Goodwin, would say all this turning right stuff is the liberals' fault because they've left the ordinary decent people behind in favour of annoying identity politics. So they've lost the red ball, they've lost the people, the ordinary people. Have they got a point there?
No, it's effective. If there is a culprit, it's probably neoliberalism, and more specifically, it's probably the concentration of wealth or the shift in commercial imperatives to enriching shareholders at all costs. But of course, as people feel more and more dispossessed, or their children can't afford a home, the person whispering in their ear that it's all the fault of Johnny Foreigner over there becomes more and more important and more dangerous. And if you are the person whispering in people's ears that the reason why they haven't got what they feel they deserve, and which I would argue that they do deserve as part of the social contract, the reason the person whispering in their ears then has to point at the people who are saying, no, that really isn't why your children can't buy a house. It really is not the fault of newly arrived people it was Romania for a while and Poland and a subcontinent. So if you're in the business of pouring poison into people's ears, you have to describe the people providing the antidote in very unpleasant terms. So you have to blame them for the problems that you are pretending exist in order to get your books commissioned and your newspaper articles published. And there's some... Again, you'd struggle to make a list of people who would be on this list, but certainly complaining about immigration has been a national sport for as long as I can remember. It's certainly for as long as I can get on the radio. The number of calls I took in the early days from people who would say, you can't talk about immigration in this country. And I just run through what other presenters on the station had done over the last, say, 5 days, and there'd have been an immigration conversation almost every day, consisting largely of people with very negative views of it. What I started doing when I arrived was ask them to back up the claims they were making, ask them to provide some evidence that this was the root of the problems they described, because the problems exist. It just, they were not largely the result of immigration. And people pointing that out are persona non grata, really, in the media ecosystem that we've already described. And they do this thing, a bit like Boris Johnson, Eton and Oxford, claiming to be anti-establishment or claiming to be scuppered by the blob. They claim, despite owning about 80% of the media space, they claim that they're sort of being closed down or cancelled. I think in academia, because obviously the reliance on evidence and reason is much, much higher than it would be in most other areas, then people possessed of these sort of positions probably do find it quite hard to get ahead. But my goodness me, the opportunities in the media can more than make up for that. And it necessitates attacking this largely mythical but certainly tiny bunch of people who they claim are scuppering their professional chances and cancelling them all the time. I don't know anyone who's claimed to be cancelled who hasn't gone on a nationwide book tour to talk about it, had their own TV show or newspaper column. I'm exaggerating, obviously.
See, obviously, the opportunity for me, I have been once, but I've never talked about it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It's tempting.
Yeah. Now, you're saying that a lot of that liberal font thing is a con, that ordinary people have been somehow manipulated. But if they have, how exactly has it been done? Now, you've said blame them, blame them, blame them. But who in particular is most to blame? You've named 10 people in how they broke Britain. Is it those people?
Yeah, probably. I mean, you certainly don't have to search very hard to find people who have worked very, very hard to blame immigrants specifically for national problems. And I'm not talking about the kind of specific examples when one criminal is used to somehow sully an entire demographic or because, two group of people are caught committing crimes and therefore you claim everybody of the same ethnicity or the same religion or the same background is therefore criminal by association or at the very least dodgy. I just mean the more kind of abstract atmosphere that has really been created in the last 10 years or more, whereby everybody coming here was diminishing the state of the nation as opposed to almost, usually improving it. And it's the cynicism of it that I think is most helpful in understanding. It's because the way they will shift effortlessly from Polish builders to Romanian neighbours to Muslim taxi drivers to whatever it may be. The role of othering. I'm reading a brilliant book at the moment. You should, if you haven't already, called The Nazi Mind by Lawrence Rees, 12 Warnings from History. And he's absolutely scrupulous in not making any explicit parallels with the modern world. But God, they're jumping off every page implicitly. And the biggest one is the us versus them myth. The idea that if you want to get power, then dishonestly and cynically and dangerously, then the people who will put you in power have to be persuaded that there's an enemy within, that there's a fifth column. Fewer than 1% of the German population in the 1930s was Jewish. It's incredible to think that. And what we see in this country, the demonisation, it's called pseudo-speciation when they make Jews rats in Goebbels' films. You've seen that in a Daily Mail cartoon in 2015 when literally you had silhouettes of Middle Eastern people and rats crossing the border where the sign said freedom of movement, welcome to the European Union. You had Donald Trump saying they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. It's a dehumanisation, which is at the moment in Britain and in America, with the exception of that Muslim ban, it's been quite democratic dehumanisation. It's been pretty much anybody foreign. And that has been a consequence of the media and latterly the Conservative Party plus Farage very deliberately doing it for years. And I think it's shifted. I'm fascinated by this, and I haven't written about this bit much. But the kind of radio phone-ins that were commonplaces. You're kind enough to mention what they said in the New Statesman about me a few years ago. And it's true. The radio phone-in space was dominated by a lot of heat and no light, a lot of largely unevidenced anger, coming from the presenters at least as much as the callers. And it's now moved in. So I thought that I was at the vanguard of a vanquishing, because my show's more popular than all of theirs. I thought that I was somehow slowly turning the oil tanker around. But it turns out that the oil tanker is now politics. It's not just the fringes, the Daily Mail columnist extremities now. It's moved into the heart of the political establishment. So these, the lazy demonisation of people that weren't born here, including by people whose parents weren't born here, and then the demonisation of the unemployed. A modern flavour on that will be people who are off work because of their mental health. They must all be shirkers and skivers. The lazy othering of people of whom you have no personal examples, or next to no personal examples. It will be my neighbour's cousin's window cleaner. They're the ones that have got their Schrodinger's benefits claimant, and Schrodinger's immigrant is stealing jobs and also signing on and sending benefits back home. So just every society has problems. Every society has a few skivers and scroungers in it. But this attempt to kind of malign swathes of the population as being unworthy of decency, unworthy even of human rights in their purest form and in their legislative form, it really has gathered pace, perhaps inevitably since 2016. You sell an entire population something as bogus as Brexit, you can hardly stop lying the next day and start telling the truth. You have to just keep redirecting their dissatisfaction and their anger in new directions, or in new variations on the old direction. So that the person getting their news from the Mail Online, or that the British equivalent of people watching Fox News, have very, very little personal experience of immigration. But every single time they read about it, it's going to be in the context of criminality or wrongdoing. And, the ridiculous proportion of people here who were born somewhere else who don't do anything wrong or don't commit crimes is largely ignored. It's as if, all radio presenters and TV presenters were viewed as potential Jimmy Saviles. That's pretty much what they've done to immigration. And I sometimes wonder if they realise what they've unleashed.
What about people like Goodhart and Goodwin? Because they were both once sort of acceptably part of a soft left liberal conversation. And Goodhart, as a young man, could proudly say, I am the only Etonian Marxist in my street in North London. And Goodwin was part of a combine of clever academics who wrote Revolt on the Right.
Yeah.
How come they're where they are now?
I don't know a lot about Goodhart. I know a bit about Goodwin because he became Farage's sort of Boswell and wrote some absolute gibberish about me in one of his books that was brought to my attention about an interview I did with Farage a few years ago. So I kind of kept an eye on him since, and he's always writing articles for the best-selling newspaper in the country about how he's been cancelled and can't get his work anywhere. I think it's quite simple. I could be wrong. And there might be a sort of osmosis process, so you spend lots of time with these people and you end up thinking that they're actually right. But I think we saw it during COVID, the same psychological process on social media, where people just get a dopamine hit from the attention, and people would start writing things about vaccines or writing things about lockdowns or writing things about the World Health Organization. And so febrile was the atmosphere that people who'd never really been noticed before, or certainly hadn't received the levels of attention that they either knowingly or unknowingly craved, suddenly started getting loads of attention, and you get addicted to that. So your next thing has to go even further. You have to step even deeper. I think this is how people like Alex Jones end up claiming that that school massacres in America are hoaxes. Because what on earth do you do if you're addicted to the response you get from your outrageous interventions? So I imagine with certainly one of them, the one that I'm more aware of, Goodwin, I imagine he just felt that the recognition he would get, albeit from pretty much the entire index of how they broke Britain, they're not people whose approval I would particularly crave. But if you're desperate for approval and you don't think you're getting enough from the academic establishment or from the people that you've associated with in the past, and then the polar opposite people come along and start giving you attention, start giving you approval, I think it becomes seductive and hard to resist. I don't know if that's too generous or if that's not generous enough.
You haven't mentioned money.
Well, I kind of...
You haven't mentioned money, or what
all right.
Some people might call the grifter factor in this.
I don't think there's a lot of money in writing academic treatises about this. Well, there's certainly not
There's
a lot
of money writing in the Daily Mail.
That's what I mean. I don't think there's much money in doing the opposite. You know,
Yes.
Possibly present company accepted. I earn a good living, but I'm not an academic. I'm a journalist, and if you are not making the advances in the academic world that you think you should be making, then perhaps the lure of attention times money does become irresistible. And the other thing, I read a review of his latest book by Sebastian Payne, where it was suggested in the paper at the weekend, where it was just suggested that he didn't do in academia as well as he clearly thought he should have done, but it's possibly the case that he was the only one possessed of that opinion of his talents.
Yes. His former collaborator,
Rob
Ford.
Yeah, a big fan of his. I'm a big fan of his.
Says that he's gone silly.
Yes.
And that as an academic thinker, proposing that the new elite is every graduate who has to work in McDonald's practically, that there are about anywhere between 12 and 20 million of these rad-trog people who run the country now. 20 million various academic civil servants and other very radical progressive people run the country. That's what he says. It's an amazing theory and most exciting, but according to Rob Ford, absolutely silly.
Well, I'd go back to my name them trope. I'd say, let's start making a list, shall we? And see how long it takes us to get to 20 million.
Now, before you go, the BBC. How do you feel about the BBC now?
But I suspect, and we've not had this conversation before in any depth, I suspect I feel very similar to you. I think it's captured. I think there's still some brilliant journalists there doing brilliant work. But when you can't hold on to someone like Michelle Hussein, and you are holding on to and promoting to the highest echelon someone like Laura Kuenssberg, I don't think you need to be forensic to work out what's happened there. And you have Robbie Gibb on the board, ennobled by Theresa May. At the moment when he criticised my friend Lewis Goodall for being biased, and you just sort of thought, okay, that no one at the BBC has really been prepared for this. No one was ready to stand up against the takeover. So a certain querulousness or cowardice in a managerial class, coupled with a false notion of equivalence, the idea that if... I tell you when the BBC died for me, Peter. And no, that's too extreme. As I say, they're still the best we've got in so many ways. But I remember when I was presenting Newsnight, I've told this story many times, so I'll be brief. And I really, really, really wanted someone to pick apart the claim that we'll be fine under World Trade Organization rules. I don't know if you remember, there was a whole chapter of the Brexit debacle where the usual suspects were claiming we don't need a deal at all. We can trade on we can do all our trade on WTO rules. And they had banners saying, let's go WTO. And I knew no one knew what that meant. All of the people shouting it, like Liberal Elite, like all the other things we've talked about today, all of these slogans, these powerful slogans, are powerful until you ask someone what they mean or until you ask someone who is in that group. And so what does WTO rules mean? And nobody knew. So someone like Farage would be brilliant at disguising the fact that he didn't have a clue. Are you really telling me that we, Great Britain, wouldn't be able to do this and do that? And yes, they were telling him that because it was true. But the way he sort of blusters and Johnson say this is absolutely fine. And so I wanted someone to come on and tell me what was what regarding the WTO. And Pascal Lamy was in town, who until recently had been the Director General of the whole bloody outfit, the Director General of the World Trade Organization. So we booked him in and we're getting ready to research the interview when one of the producers says that obviously we'll have to get someone on from the other side. And I said, well, there is no other side. Do you mean we'll have to get someone on who has never been Director General of the World Trade Organization? What is the qualification to challenge the former Director General's position on the organization he used to be the Director General of? And If I have a live audience, I normally pause at this point for effect, but I'll tell you now, they booked Andrea Leadsom.
Oh, that's heavyweight.
Well, to tell Pascal Lamy that he didn't know what he was talking about when it came to WTO rules. And, I mean, there are two elements of this that are worth noting. The first, and by far the most important, is how ridiculous that was for a viewer or a licence payer, because it's insulting to think that she has anything of substance to say on a subject she knew absolutely nothing about. So in a way, the two sides became the person who knows everything, but we must balance that out with the person who knows nothing. But, and I didn't realise this at the time, looking back, the other notable element of that is that she said yes. And they all would have done. They would all have come on and claimed that, you know, that Jam Tomorrow, this glorious future that was not going to be held back by the confines of logic or knowledge, or we don't need to worry about any of those things anymore, like gravity, because we're all going to be fantastic. And so I sat there and she started talking after I'd interviewed Pascal, and he caught my eye, and happily the director caught this moment as well, and he, you can't see me, but he did the old curly whirly cuckoo mime live in the studio, and while, you know, expressing on his face just utter gobsmackedness at what he was hearing. And, you know, that we're still there. These people are still in the box seats, you know, they're still not being required to account for why everything they promised hasn't turned up, hasn't materialised, and they're certainly not anywhere close to apologising. Kemi Badenoch the other day said it, didn't she? She said that Brexit was undertaken without any plan whatsoever, but no one thought to ask her why the hell she voted for it then, or why the hell she supported it from every level of her political career up to this point, or why she continues to promote the people responsible for taking the United Kingdom into this form of, by her own description, this form of political oblivion.
Now, I'm glad you did what you did and that you're doing what you're doing, but there was a time when we, some of us, thought you were going to be the front man on Newsnight and wear a nice blue suit. So what happened there?
Well, I can tell you exactly what happened, but whether or not my theory is fair, well, there's two things to say. The first is I really love my job. I really love LBC. I love working here, and I've got 1.5 million listeners, which is, I mean, that's dreamland for a Newsnight audience. And I think that in a previous era, I would have been able to do both. I would have been able to continue to express quite strong opinions on LBC. People would accept that I was capable of being impartial on the BBC, in much the same way that Andrew Neil could publish all sorts of far-right adjacent bilge in The Spectator, but he did maintain, I believe, impartiality when he was working at the BBC. It's obviously wrong that he's allowed to do that and I'm not, but that's because the people who would complain about me would be from the right-wing media ecosystem. And there were three things that I think made it untenable. There was my opinions about Donald Trump, all of which have been borne out by events, my opinions about Brexit, all of which have been borne out by events, and my opinions about Boris Johnson, all of which have been borne out by events. And so I was either going to have to not talk about them on the radio, which would have been somewhat tricky during the relevant periods, or not present on the BBC. And in the end, the decision was really quite straightforward. A couple of big old-timers at the Beeb told me how important it was to keep my voice and not to sort of come into the fold over there and lose my freedom to speak truth to power, which is, as you know, we often reflect, it's probably more important now than ever before. But also, not just out of loyalty to LBC, but out of honesty, if it had come down to a straight choice without any issues of impartiality or bias or speaking truth to power, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination convinced that I'd have gone the other way. I think I'd still probably have jumped this way, because I've had a unique opportunity here over 20 years to build something that hasn't been seen before in the British media, and it would have taken a lot to walk away.
You're absolutely right. But what about the blue suit?
I do miss the aesthetics of it. I'm not good on TV. I've got bad posture. My eye always is drawn to my hairline, or my what's increasingly looks like a tonsure on the top of my head. But for some reason, the aesthetics of the Newsnight studio suited me, and I looked like I belonged there. It's never happened in any other television studio. Also, I was rocking waistcoats at one point. It's the only time. You're a great sartorial guru. But my days in menswear are a long way behind me, and Newsnight was the only time where I indulged my enthusiasm for quality, top quality schmutter, in the way that I had done when I was flogging suits on Regent Street. So I do miss that. You're quite right to pick up on that.
And that most people in the world don't know that your career in media started when you were flogging menswear
Yes.
at Aqua Scutum, right?
Aqua Scutum, 100
Regent Street. And you sold a white suit to John Major, then
This is it.
King of
Prime
Minister, and you got that into a newspaper, or rather, you traded it for a job in a newspaper.
For a couple of shifts, every other avenue by that point had shut down. I had some advantages with my dad being a newspaper journalist, but I'd called in all those favours and they'd come to naught. I still had the privilege of that background when I turned up to do the shifts, because it meant I might have known a couple of people on the news desk and I could phone my dad and say, what do I do now? But by the time I was trying to get into journalism, all of his proper contacts had either been made redundant or died. So no, I just phoned up, they offered me some money and I said, can I come in and do a couple of shifts instead? And they said yes, and I never left, happily. That was probably the last roll of the dice. A job had come up, Peter, to be a regional manager at Aqua Scutum, to take charge of some of the concessions in the department stores around the country. And you'd have a management position that had, say, 6 of them. So you'd travel between all 6 of them in your working week. And I was poised to put in for that job because the media dream, the journalism dream, was not happening. And that was about the same time that the shifts, I started getting more shifts. And I had this wonderful manager at Aqua Scutum called Bob. And he had a son of a similar age trying to get into a completely different sector after university. But he knew how important it was to be available. So he said to me, if you get a late call, just let me know. I'll work the rotas. I'll work the roster. So, because I know you don't want to be here forever.
Isn't that great?
Not really. And he knew I loved the job, and I really loved working in that play. But he knew I wanted to be a journalist, and so oddly, when you credit people with getting into the business you wanted to get into, he wasn't in it at all. But it meant if Londoners' Diary said, "Can you come in on Tuesday?" I could ask him on Monday, in the shop.
You did Londoners' Diary.
I did them all for a while. I did Londoners' Diary, I did Mandrake at the Sunday Telegraph. I never quite got my feet under the table on Peterborough at the Daily Telegraph. I relaxed when I got offered a 3-day-a-week contract on the William Hickey column at the Daily Express and a 2-day-a-week contract on the Mandrake column at the Sunday Telegraph. And I thought, I'm going to be all right. I wasn't actually allowed to do them both. The Express editor said, you can't do shifts on the other one. So we'll give you a 3-day-a-week contract and we'll make it worth your while so that you don't need to do the 2 days on the other paper. And that's when I relaxed. I still did Saturdays in the shop for a while, so I'd do 3 weekdays on the paper and then Saturdays in the shop. And then when I really relaxed, when I finally unclenched, that would have been when I handed in my notice at Aqua Scutum and lost a source of stories as well.
And lost a source of stories. Alas, it went bust.
It did. Not as a consequence of me leaving,
No.
I don't think. No. But I had all sorts of mates on Jermyn Street. So, there was one shop that used to make the ministerial boxes. And I think I got a couple of stories about ministers either damaging a ministerial box or breaking a ministerial box. And I could bung them a few quid and take them out for a slap-up feed with all the trimmings somewhere in the West End. And so I had quite a good little seam of scoops coming in from the retail, from the high-end retail world around Regent Street and Bond Street and Jermyn Street. And I missed that world. I loved it. I loved it.
Yes, this was Tim Nice but not dim. Sort of Sloane Ranger work, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, exactly that.
We had all a lot of fun. I know it well.
I know you do.
I know it well from when, before I got a bit geeky. These things happen, but there are other obvious fantastic opportunities for you.
Yes.
Sir Paul Marshall, he'd go a bundle on you, I'm sure.
Yes.
Or James Harding at Tortoise. Now he's bought The Observer. I'm almost serious about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting project, that.
It's a funny story.
It is a funny story. I don't know it fully. And I know a lot of Observer journalists, many of them are departing now, are very, very unhappy about it. I rate Tortoise. Tortoise has done good work. But as you say, this element is a funny story that I don't quite I don't quite know. So Paul Marshall, I mean, GB News, I read, has lost £100 million in 3 years. So if they're not buying commercial success, you have to ask what they're getting in return for their money.
And he's lashed out on The Spectator.
Yeah.
And he wants, apparently still wants, The Telegraph, unless that very pro-Israeli New Yorker gets it.
Right. Yes, of course.
We have to watch this closely.
But remember, the media is dominated by leftists and liberals, Peter. That's the very important.
Yes.
Very important. It takes us back to almost where we started, doesn't it?
It's dominated by leftists.
By all those leftists that
Yes.
you can just. If we start listing them now, we'll still be here by next Christmas. There's so many of them. There's so many of them.
Exactly so. James, thank you very, very much indeed for talking to me. I still treasure the idea of you suited and booted and waistcoated,
Yes.
but I think you've done the right thing.
Thank you.
Eventually, and so long should you and LBC, because there's a lot of fun to be had on LBC, one way or another. A lot of personalities to be had, of very different kinds, but very fascinating. I enjoy it very much. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for the work that you do.
Huge thanks to James O'Brien. In the next episode of my podcast, it's only a week away, I'll be talking to Gabriel Gatehouse, the former international editor of BBC Newsnight. He's an award-winning journalist and the author and presenter of BBC Radio 4's epic series, The Coming Storm, where we'll venture into the heart of the huge American conspiracy machine. Do join me then. Goodbye.